Hello, and welcome to Being Messianic. Today, we are looking at something a little bit different. The whole idea of this program and this discussion that we open it up to people is that it's to look at our Hebrew roots and to see things in a different way, see things from the way of people in Jesus' time or in the biblical times, and how those apply to us today, and looking at how an Israelite would have seen things and what it would have meant to them. Because often when we read the scriptures, it's so important that we look at who it was written for at the time and how it applies to us, because very often the words that we use don't actually mean the same thing, or they have a deeper meaning that we may miss if we don't go back and look at that. And that's what we're looking at today. So today we are looking at a special place. We are looking at the threshing floor, a Goren. So a Goren holds a significant, special significance beyond its just agricultural or the threshing part of it. It represents a place of separation, purification, divine judgment, and it's linked to very significant events in the Israelite history and their religious lives. And it applies to us today. So a threshing, when you thresh the wheat or thresh the grain, you're taking the wheat from the chaff. So you're cleansing or purifying the wheat. You're getting rid of the unwanted. When you think about the Temple Mount was also, it had been a threshing floor and it was a place of getting rid of the unwanted chaff. And just as the temple should be a place of purification. So there's a lot of meaning that goes beyond just all of this. And that's what we're going to be looking at today. So let's look at the agricultural part of it. So a threshing floor was a flat, open area. Typically, it was on a hilltop where grain was separated from the straw and the husk. So the farmers, what they do is they'd spread out the harvested grain on the floor, and they could use oxen or they would use flails, like whips type things, which loosen the grain from the stalks. And then the mixture of grain and chaff would then be tossed up into the air. The heavier grains fall right back to the ground, while the lighter chaff is just blown away in the wind. And you can see there's a lot of meaning in that alone. So the process of separating the wheat from the chaff became a powerful metaphor for the divine judgment and purification in the biblical literature. And that's why we see it so much in the Bible. It represents the separation of the righteous from the wicked, the valuable from the worthless, and the pure from the impure. So the wheat often symbolizes the faithful who's going to be gathered, while the chaff represents the unrighteous who will be scattered and consumed. And you can see that in Psalm chapter 1, verse 4, or Matthew chapter 3, verse 12. So this was also we look at the description of it. And like I said, it's a hard cylinder plot of ground, paved and compact. And it's just a place, you would think of it just as a place. But again, there's a lot more to it that is in there. So the threshing floor was a very sacred place. As I said, we know that there was a time of harvest and celebrations that they would go to there because they were an agricultural people. So they went to the threshing floor for some of their celebrations. And once they cleaned it off, think about it, it'd also be a good place to meet and to possibly dance or to celebrate in any way. So one of the examples is Ruth and Boaz, and Ruth 3. That story takes place on the threshing floor, where Boaz demonstrates his commitment to Ruth and his role as her redeemer and kinsman. So one of the most notable examples of the threshing floor is where we have the Jebusite in First and Second Temples in Jerusalem. So in 2 Samuel 24, King David purchased the threshing floor to build an altar to the Lord, to end this plague that had afflicted Israel. And the Lord told him to buy the threshing floor area and then to sacrifice there, and that ended the plague. And later, David's son Solomon constructed the first temple on the very spot. So this transformation from the secular agricultural site to the holiest place in Israel, the Temple Mount, it kind of underscores the theme of purification and consecration. So just as you had this threshing floor separating the valuable grain from the worthless chaff, the temple became the place for the center of purification rituals, where the people of Israel would go to be cleansed and reconciled with God. Remember, once a year they would go and have for Yom Kippur, they would go and have all of the sacrifices. There were sacrifices throughout the year, but of course, during the High Holy Days was one of the big areas where they were really going up to the Temple Mount for that. So One of the things you have to think about it is the practicality of the um, the hard labor that was done on the threshing floor. So while it's rich in symbolism, think about the immense labor and the community effort. It took a lot of people to do the threshing process. It was dusty, it was dirty, it was physically demanding, and often you would go late into the night during a harvest season because you had to get it in before it rained. You had to get these things done while it was still dry. So this aspect really highlights the Israelites' absolute dependence on God's provision for their substance and the gratitude for the successful harvest. They often express this from direct offerings from the threshing floor. But what makes it special? What makes the threshing floor special? Well, as I said, it's a symbol of judgment separation. And you, it also, I mentioned Matthew, and it's also in Luke 3:17, and you also in Hosea 13:3, where you have the symbolization where the wicked chaff is being separated, and you have where God is distinguishing between the good and the evil, where nations are facing their divine reckoning. It's also a sacred space. We also know that there were divine encounters there. It was often a place where there was very many religious activities and divine interventions occurred, such as stopping a plague. And we know that sometimes God was depicted as appearing. For example, on the temple, when the first temple was built, he came into there is smoke. So there was this cloud that came over it. And we know that that's when the Shekinah was there. So we know that his appearance was there at that time. So it was a sacred place and divine encounters. So again, this is where they had all this. Some of the key biblical events that happened there. So again, it was the foundation of Solomon's temple. It was one of, and we know that from 2 Samuel 24:1 and 1 Chronicles 21. This location became the Solomon's temple. Um, Another thing, now this is not the same place, but threshing floors. Why threshing floors are important. So we also have Ruth and Boaz, where Ruth and Boaz unfolded a threshing floor. I'm not suggesting that it's the same one because we actually don't know, but there is a threshing floor in that as well. We also have where Gideon, his encounter with the angels. Gideon threshed the wheat at the wine press to hide it from the Midianites, and at a sign of his call, the dew-covered fleece was found on the threshing floor, marking as a place of divine reassurance, and that's in Judges chapter 6. We also know that the threshing floors can be a national mourning. So, for example, when Jacob died in Genesis chapter 50, verses 10 through 11, we know that there was a mourning at the threshing floor. People came to the threshing floor to mourn him. And again, there's a connection with the offerings and the blessings. So, offering and tithes were presented from the threshing floor, significant a role in God's provision as people. So, one of the you had to have a grain offering, such as in Numbers 18:27 and 30, and then in Joel chapter 2:24. You know that there was different grain offerings that were required that came from the threshing floor. So, the specialness of the Hebrew word for threshing floor, particularly Goren, stems from the deep cultural, symbolic, and its historical significance. It represents just not a physical location, but the nexus of divine action, our human activity, and it gives us a spiritual meaning. So the biblical word for threshing floor, Goren, is special because the word itself is within the Torah, and it stems from a combination of its roots and the layers of meaning that it's gotten through the ages. So we're going to look at a little bit of breakdown about the word itself because words in the Torah have significant meaning. The words were used for a reason. So Goring comes from an unused root meaning smooth or to make even. And that would be the physical nature of the threshing floor, the hard, flat, often elevated, deliberately prepared areas to have the threshing and the winnowing of the grain. So the connection between the word's root and physical preparation of the site highlights the intentionality and the significance of these spaces. And we're going to get a little bit more into that because I found it interesting how they chose those. Oops, I apologize. I hit my wrong thing. So one of the other things we go into the expansion of the word. So again, the word means a smoothed area, but often they used it for any open level area where they would do threshing or using a barn or granary. So sometimes the word was used in a lot of different areas. But the word itself, while, as I said, words have special meanings in Hebrew. And though this word isn't grammatically unique, it's repeated throughout the Torah. And it has a strong symbolic weight in the Torah. It has the separation and judgment. It's the sacred ground. It's provision and blessing. So it has a lot of meaning just from that particular word. So separation and judgment. As I said, it's a separating. You're separating the wheat from the chaff. So you're having this refinement and purification. Just as you have the valuable grain and it's purified from the unwanted straw and the husk, the threshing floor often represented a process where God refined his people. He removed the impurities of sin and brought forth a purer, more valuable outcome. So this is less about the threshing floor should be less about the condemnation and judgment. It's more about sanctification and the blessings from God, what we're getting. And also, often it was symbolized as divining or discerning truth. So it was a metaphor for discerning truth from falsehood, how we look at things. It had a lot of meaning using the word. What's interesting is anytime it's always important to look at, we talk about that there has to be two or more witnesses. And how many times a word is used in the Torah is often very important. Well, in the Old Testament of our Bible, it's used 36 times. What's interesting is it's used 7 times in the Torah. So you have in Genesis and Numbers and Deuteronomy. So we're going to look at that a little bit more. So when you look at it, what's fascinating is that Genesis, it's referred to 2 times. It's both in reference to the threshing floor for when they're mourning Dave or Jacob. In Numbers, it's 3 times. And these are within the legal sections concerning how we do our offerings and tithes. And we talked about the grain offering, and you had the first dough of the bread offering. So the first dough of your dough from your threshing floor, it's very specific about where it comes from. And then in Deuteronomy, you see it in chapter 15 and chapter 16, where it's also in the legal context, how you free servants and celebrate the Feast of Sukkot after gathering from the threshing floor. So Sukkot, yes, they were in the booths or in the small shelters that they made to remind themselves of leaving Egypt. They also would go and celebrate at the threshing floor because that was where the fruits of the grains, and this was at the harvest time. So you're going to see a lot of things there upon it as well. So let's look a little bit more into these. There are 7 scriptures where in the Torah. So the first one is in Genesis 50, and they came to threshing. As I said, the first ones really are about the mourning. We're mourning for Jacob. So this is a time where we gather and we all go together to mourn, and we go. And again, do we not go to the Temple Mount to mourn as well? We do. So the inhabitants of the land of Canaanites saw the mourning of the threshing floor. So they saw this was a grievous mourning. And then in Numbers, this, as I said, was where your first dough, you shall offer up cake as a heave offering. It's from the threshing floor. So you have to have the first dough. And then you're going to be reckoning your grain through the threshing floor. So there's those where you're very specific. And then the next ones and Numbers, and you shall say them, the best thereof. You're giving more detail about what the Levites got, because remember the the Levites did not have any land. Everyone else had land, but they did not, and they had to be provided for because they were responsible for the temple and the Temple Mount, taking care of things. So then Deuteronomy, you shall furnish them liberally out of your flock and your threshing floor and out of your winepress. So these are very clear instructions that were given. And again, as I talked about in Sukkot, there's also very clear instructions about we had to have things from the threshing floor. So we talk about bread and we talk about Jesus is the bread of life and all this, but threshing and the bread were so important in those times that this is mentioned that many times in the scriptures because it is so important. So now we're going to look at the threshing floor. So a less common word is adar, which appears only once in the entire Bible. In the book of Daniel's chapter 2, verse 35, it's not part of the Torah, but that is part of our Bible. Um, so this particular way to say Goren is only used once. And it is a very significant mention of it because this is, it's not intended probably to be once, but it was only once. So it's interesting that they use the Aramaic word, but consider where Daniel was and everything. It's probably a large part of that's why it was used, but you'll see it used in the Old Testament. And there, as I said, there's several threshing floors that are mentioned in the Bible besides the Temple Mount, but a lot of the things that you'll see, for example, in Ezra, there's sections for historical and other reasons. So there's different reasons why it's mentioned, but there you go. It's mentioned. This version I thought was a little interesting that it's only mentioned once in the Bible. So let's go back to the Bible. So again, we know some of the major ones were the location of Joseph and his family observed the 7-day mourning period for Jacob. So again, out of every place they went to in Egypt, they went, or when they were going to worship and to mourn their father, they went to a threshing floor. And I thought that was interesting. Why did they go to the threshing floor? And then Ezra, there's also occurred in the threshing floor where Ezra died after touching the Ark of the Covenant as it was being transported. And then, of course, we have a different threshing floor with Boaz, where in the chapter of Ruth. And then you have Gideon, like I mentioned. But then there's also the threshing floors are frequently metaphorically mentioned in the prophetic books. And we have them in the New Testament as well. And they're used, when you see them, they're used to symbolize judgment, separation of the righteous from the wicked, and again, the divine reckoning. How we're separating the wheat from the chaff. So you have those. We don't always know the physical location of those, but we are getting those in the different versions throughout the Bible. And again, it is very much you hear this in the New Testament. So these thoughts, when the disciples and the people in Jesus' time heard this, they would have been very familiar with the threshing floor. They would have had a lot of context. They would have had a lot of meaning to it. And they also knew that the Temple Mount had been the threshing floor. So they knew all of those things. So when you get to John the Baptist prophecy, where he has the image of the threshing floor, and he's speaking of Jesus, and he says his winnowing fork is in his hand, and he will clear the threshing floor and gather his wheat in the barn, but the chaff he will burn with the unquenchable fire, in Matthew chapter 3 and Luke chapter 3. So here he's prophesying that Jesus is going to come and rule and reign, and he's coming back. So we see those things where the threshing floor is very clear in the New Testament about being a time and a place of separating the bad from the good. So we look at this as a spiritual harvest in the Bible, and we look at how we're gathering souls into God's kingdom. It's the culmination of God's redemptive plan and the ultimate separation of humanity. So the threshing floor with the process of gathering, separation, purification, which was a lot of work, as we talked about. That was a lot of work to separate the wheat, especially that way. I mean, here in America, I grew up on a farm, and that's not how we did it, I can tell you that. We had machines that did it, and it still was hard work, even with the machines. So these are a metaphor for the spiritual realities as well. So the gathering of the souls, the harvest itself, we see this in Matthew chapter 9, where he said to his disciples, the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Remember, we needed a lot of people to do this. We needed a lot of people to gather in the harvest in that time frame. You couldn't have just done it with a few people. It took the community. It took people to do it. So in this case, in the spiritual, the workers are few. Ask the Lord of the harvest, therefore, to send out workers to his harvest field. So we know that this is where, Jesus was also sending out the disciples, and he sends people out to go and gather people together. And then John 4, don't you have a saying, it's 4 months till harvest? I tell you, open your eyes and look at the fields. They are ripe for harvest. So Jesus told them that there was a spiritual readiness for the people to respond. When it is time, when the Holy Spirit tells you to go talk to somebody, he's telling you to go to them because there's a spiritual readiness. It's time to go to them. And then even in Revelations, then another angel came out of the temple and called in a loud voice to him who was sitting on the cloud, "Take your sickle and reap, because the time to reap has come, for the harvest of the earth is ripe." And he was seated on a cloud, swung his sickle over the earth was harvested. So now we have this huge global harvest at the end of the age. We know that that is coming from the book of Revelations. So again, we have the separation and judgment. And you have this in Matthew chapter 3, and you have it in Luke again, chapter 3. And you have the parable of the wheat and tares, where we learn the stories about, it doesn't exactly use threshing floor, but it's talking about threshing, which would have been at the threshing floor. So let them both grow together until harvest. At that time, I will tell the harvesters, first collect the weeds and tie them in bundles to be burned. Then gather the wheat and bring it to my barn. And Jesus explained the separation from the righteous from the wicked at the end of age by doing this. So you see that there's a lot of different times where it's shown how the threshing occurs and why this is so important and why this is such a great metaphor for what is yet to come. And then we go to the purification and refinement, the results of the threshing. So in Malachi, but who can endure the day of his coming? Who can stand when he appears? For he will be like the refiner's fire or launderer's soap. He will sit as a refiner of purification of silver. He will purify the Levites and refine them like gold and silver. Then the Lord will have men who will bring offerings to righteousness. So you see that there's different ways of purification, but there's still the purification. And then in First Peter chapter 1, in all this you greatly rejoice, for now for a little while you have yet to suffer grief and all the kinds of trials. These have come so the proven genuineness of your faith, for greater worth than gold, which perishes even through refined by fire, may result in praise, glory, and honor when Jesus Christ is revealed. Just as Jesus had to go through the temptation in the wilderness, there can be times where we have to go through a time of purification, a time of testing, a time where we're having to turn back and make sure we're just totally relying on God, which we should do all the time. Also, in these metaphors, you also have the provision and abundance. We know that the Lord provides. You have when he provided the manna or that type of bread from heaven, it was his heavenly bread that he provide. And then he also provides the grain. He provides the so that we can have a nourishment. Just like the word, we just have the spiritual nourishment and it comes through, and that's more important. So this is why you have these things. The valuable grain was stored, and it was representing God's provision, blessing, and spiritual abundance. And you see this in Joel chapter 2. The threshing floor will be full of grain, the vats overflow with new wine and oil. So it's the connection of restoration, abundant provision after a repentance. There was a repentance in Joel. And in Proverbs, honor the Lord with your wealth, with the first fruits of all your crops, and your barns will be filled overflowing, your vats will be filled with new wine. So we need to make sure that we are honoring God, and we are uh, in we saw in the first time few times it's in the Torah that it's part of the whole where we're supposed to give back to the Lord. We should be doing that as well. How do we give back to the Lord? How do we give from our abundance? How do we give from what he has given to us? We can give tithes and we can give offerings. So, one of the things, as I mentioned, I grew up on a farm, and I literally couldn't figure this one out. This one really threw me for a loop as to why would you put a threshing floor on top of a mountain? You have to take all of that grain. The grain's not growing up there. The grain's growing down below. It would be growing off into these fields that are over to the side in this picture. And you're actually going to a lot of work to get it up there. And so I wondered why David purchased that place to sacrifice and later the temple would be there. So I had to actually think about that and look into this a little bit because there's a reason. And there's an analogy that connects God's temple being built on the mountain with the same mountain being the perfect place for the threshing floor because it gives you the design intent, the inherent design for the divine purpose. So you have to imagine this vast, fertile agricultural area. They were is stretching out for miles all around here. You have the city in this picture, and you have all around it, you have the fields. And then they would turn around and take this to the top of that mountain. So, some reasons why we do that: exposure to the wind. The elevated position guarantees the maximum exposure to the prevailing winds. So the act of winnowing, tossing the grain into the air so the lighter chest blows away, and the heavier grains will fall to the ground when you're doing that. It depends upon a strong, consistent breeze. A low-lying area would trap the air, making the separation inefficient or impossible. So they had to go up to where there was a breeze. They also needed a large, hard, flat surface. So you wanted a natural rock outcropping. A carefully leveled peak would provide the ideal hard, clean surface needed for the vigorous work of threshing. As I said, made this big circle and you went around. So you had to first grind the grain down into it, and then you do the winnowing and the separating the wheat and the chaff. So all of that, you had to have this big flat area. You couldn't have any mud. You couldn't have uneven ground to hinder the treading of the oxen or the dragging of the sledges. So you needed this big flat area. Also, it was visible and it was central. From such a peak, the threshing floor would be visible from afar, and it would be a central hub where the entire community's substance was processed. The fruit of their labor was brought for its final and crucial transformation. So that's why they were using that particular area. So then that made it also the perfect place for God's temple. So elevation and transcendence. So a mountain peak naturally elevates the structure. It's much higher up. It symbolizes God's transcendence, His majesty, His being above all earthly things. It's a place where you're looking up to, towards the heaven. We talked before about Jesus being on the mount and how there was another mount where Elijah and Moses were. So they were on a different mount, but they were all on mounts. So a mount is a place where you're looking up to. It's visible. You can see it easily. Just as the threshing floor would be a visible landmark for the community, a temple on the mount, and just as today you can see it, it serves as your spiritual beacon. It's the guiding light for a nation. It's a place that draws the eyes and the hearts upward. That's why they wanted it there, and that's why God wanted to put it there. So that way, when they looked up, they would always see the temple up there. And it's a separation. The physical elevation set the temple apart. It hinted at the sacredness and the holiness of the space. It's very distinct from the very common ground below. And this is a place that's set apart. It's away from the common. It's separate. It's very distinct for the holiness there. And it became a focal point. Just like the threshing floor became an economic heart of the harvest, the temple had become a spiritual heart of the nation. So in Jesus' time, they were going to the temple. They went there for I've talked about the different holidays and different reasons they went there, but there was the place where their atonement was made, the prayers were offered, and in the first temple, God's presence, and then the tabernacle, God's presence was dwelling there. So the genius of God choosing a mountain that served as the threshing floor for his temple is the very correct characteristics that made it agriculturally perfect for the separation from grain from the chaff, and it made it spiritually perfect for the separation of sacred from common, and as a perfect place for the dwelling place for his holy presence, for the Shekinah to come. It suggests the location was actually designed for the dual purpose. It had your substance, the physical and spiritual. Both the threshing floor and the temple were all about provision. One provides the physical substance, the grain, and the other is our spiritual substance, the atonement, the communion that they had with God. We as Christians don't have to do the same thing, but they were having to go to the temple to atone and commune with God. For discernment and purity, both places had this crucial separation. You had the threshing floor where you had the valuable grain and the worthless chaff. You got rid of the worthless chaff. Well, the temple, through its rituals and laws, it facilitated the separation from holy from profane and ultimately helped the people prepare to be separated unto God. That was why they were going there. And there was also divine encounters. Both places, God interacts directly with humanity. He provided the harvest on the threshing floor, and he came and you saw the cloud of him in the temple. So the mountain, God designed it in nature. It was for the nature to purify the harvest. It was perfectly designed by God to host his temple. It was the perfect place for his temple, where his presence would purify his people, and the spiritual harvest of humanity would ultimately find its focal point. That's what they were doing. They were going there to the temple. And it's just a beautiful picture of the divine intentionality. everything God does, there's more to it. When we touch the surface of something, you go a little bit on the surface when you read the scriptures, there's always more below it and keep going and going. And this is one of those areas where you just look at the surface area, but there's really more about it. So, where in scripture, why do I know that the place where David had the threshing, bought the threshing floor, it's was the same place where the temple was born, it was placed. We know this from 2 Samuel 24 and First Chronicle, because we also know that Isaac's sacrifice and Mount Moriah, it's the same place. So we know that Isaac was sacrificed or going to be sacrificed on the Temple Mount somewhere. I don't know exactly where, but somewhere on there. And these are the same places. These things happened at the same time. So it's fascinating that we know that Jesus also had to go to the Temple Mount. So it's just the ultimate testing of the place of testing and God's provision. You had Abraham and Isaac, and that became the ultimate place of sacrifice of worship to the people of going there. So it's interesting how all this came together. So you have to think about it that the threshing floor was a multifaceted spiritual symbol. It was the field of the world where humanity exists, and it's a place of gathering. And it's an unavoidable site of separation and judgment where God distinguished between the genuine and the counterfeit. It was a place of, purification and refinement. So ultimately, when you hear the word Goren and you hear all of this, it is the spiritual, think about the spiritual harvest that's yet to come and all of these things that are coming to mean all of these things. There's so much more. So it's so important to look at the way they looked at it and looked at the agricultural aspect of it. Because for us today, when we see when I first looked at separating the wheat from the chaff, even though I grew up on a farm, and a wheat farm, it didn't mean as much. But when I started really looking at this and what all of this meant and the work that went into it and how they were doing it, then it really started meaning more. And that's why I think it's so important to go back and look what it meant to the Israelites and when they were hearing this, what it meant to them. So I encourage you, as you're reading the scriptures, to take a look and ask the Lord, what did it mean to them at the time? What was it they were saying what was Jesus saying to the Israelites at the time? And then what does it mean to us today? How does it apply to us today? And when I do that, I find that I get a lot more meaning out of it, and I encourage you to do the same. So today, we are going to look at the letter Vav. So Vav is the sixth letter of the Hebrew alphabet. I skipped the fifth letter, and the reason is because it goes perfect with the message for next week. So this one, it's shaped like a hook, which often represents the connection between higher and lower realms, just as we talk about the threshing floor being up higher. So the numerical value of Vav is 6, which signifies completion in Hebrew. It's the complete object is surrounded on all 6 sides, north, south, east, west, above, and below. Also, the 6th day of creation. 6th day of creation is associated with the word yesod, meaning foundation or bonding. It's the day when Adam, as the first human, was created. And so it symbolized the task of humanity to connect with the physical and spiritual aspects of the world, using everything in the physical world to serve God, just as we looked at the threshing floor. So historically, the 6th day will correspond. This is for in Jewish beliefs. The 6th day corresponds to the 6th millennial, based upon a traditional Jewish timeline, which is we're in the current period. And this era, this timeline that we're in right now, is viewed as a time for humanity to build the foundation for the coming Messiah by increasing acts of goodness and kindness. So Jews today are being told to increase their goods and acts and kindness because the time of the Messiah, many of them believe, is coming. So the Vav not only looks like a hook, but the word Vav means hook. It's something that holds things together. It means to connect the spiritual and the physical. So when a person is connected on high, they don't fall down below. So, and also just on a syntax level, adding a Vav to the beginning of a word creates the meaning and. So, for example, if you could say "and these things," you would put a Vav at the beginning of it. So within a sentence, somebody was asking me about how you use different words like that. Vav, a lot of times you'll see an extra Vav and you'll think, well, why is a Vav on that? And it's because it's saying and and a book and whatever it's saying. So it's adding to it. So you'll see a lot of things like that. And then the vav attached to a verb converts that verb from a past to a future tense or from a future to a past tense. So, for example, the word "haya" in Hebrew means it was. If you put a V in front of it, it will be. So, by merely attaching your vav, the past is transformed into the future. In reverse, it could be if you had the word "yehe," it shall be. You could change it back and forth, and it's the vav actually adding the sixth letter actually can change the future tense and the past tense of a word. So it's kind of an interesting aspect of the word or of the letter. All right. Well, that's what I had for today. And I'm going to open it up to Pastor Henry and to the elders first.
Thank you, Gail, for another amazing class today. Thank you for your teaching on the threshing floor. And as you were talking about it, I was quite impressed by the plans of the Lord for our holiness journey. He brings us to a place of purification, of refinement, also linked to John 15, where we get pruned by the Lord. And as we get to that higher place where things get shaken and the wind blows and there is a bit of beating so that the heaviness can go away, I couldn't help but think about how that process to go high is a could be a heavy process because it's a process where the heaviness goes with the person or the heaviness goes with the grains, and then you get to that higher place where the purification happens and the refinement happens. But then higher at that higher location, I can see also that it's a place of trust where we trust in the Lord for the refinement. We also trust in Him for provision. We trust in Him that He can help us go through that process of refinement in agreement with His will because He loves us. And also, there's a place where, when we remember Abraham in Genesis with Isaac, he was going up. I couldn't help but think about the heaviness that he was going through because he's going to sacrifice his son. In his mind, that's what he was going to be doing. So there is this heaviness that goes with him. And then he gets to that place, even though he said, on the mountain, the Lord will provide. Well, when he gets there, there is still that heaviness until the Lord provides. And I really, really like really the aspect of the provision and the divine encounter that you mentioned, Gail. Yeah, so going up with heaviness and coming down refined, lighter, and sort of essential. Yeah, I think it just helps to remember that we need to continue to trust in the Lord when we get to that place when there is refinement, when there is um, sort of difficulties that are ordained by the Lord, and it is His will. And when that process is finally done, it's good to remember to remain humble because it is the Lord who initiates that refinement process and helps us to be at a place where the heaviness that was there before is no longer there. And the Lord can do another refinement process and so on and so forth through that holiness journey. So that's what I've received, and I'm really grateful for your lesson today, Gail. So thank you, and over to you.
You know, I'm glad you said that, Pastor Henry, because as you were talking about it, I was thinking about when Jesus was going up to the Temple Mount. I mean, he'd been there before. He'd obviously been there many times before, probably because they went for the every year. And the last time he was going, you were talking about the heaviness and the weight of that. And I was thinking about he knew what was going to happen and how hard. And that actually probably was a test too of getting up there because knowing what's going to happen and knowing what you're going to go through, to continue onward. I was thinking about how that applied to Jesus as well, going up to the mount.
Yes, yeah. Excellent point. And thank you for having put the linkage with Vav today, because as we see it, it is like going from that lower place to go to that higher place and getting connected and getting connected. So it is an excellent linkage with the word Vav today. So thank you, Gail.
Well, actually, the funny thing about that is, about 15 minutes ago, I changed it from another letter to Vav because I realized that the letter I had planned, I need for the letter next week. So that's why we went out of order. And the Lord just kind of put upon me to use the Vav instead. So there you go.
Mhm.
That's why
Yes,
we're using Vav today.
yes, he's amazing, changing things like that.
At the last minute for me. So yes, he provided at the last little bit.
That is true. So thank you.
Thank you, Pastor Henry. Anyone else, any of the other elders have something I wanted to share on that? And then we'll open it up to questions and thoughts.
When I think about refiner, I'm always brought back to the refiner's fire, being refined. And as you were talking, I was like, there's so many places within the word where the Lord wants to bring us to correction, cleanse us, separate things that are not of Him from us. So that's what I was like, Lord, you emphasize it in so many different ways within the word, the threshing floor, the separating of the wheat and everything. And it's like just being obedient and listening um to how he wants to cleanse us, to purify us, to bring us closer to himself. So that just kept ringing. What was it, Zechariah 13? And I will put this third into the fire and refine them as one refines silver, and test them as gold is tested. They will call upon my name, and I will answer them. I will say, they are my people, and they will say, the Lord is my God. So it's like, as you and Pastor Henry was talking, it's like, yes, we go through things, but when we come out on the other side, we have been refined, we have been purified. And that's what I kept getting as you were going through this awesome lesson today. Thank you so much for explaining more of the threshing floor. Thank you.
Well, thank you for bringing that up. It's interesting. As you were talking, I was thinking, the Lord reminded me again, I really had not planned on doing Evolve today. And the Lord brings us to different things, and it was really reminding me of what I had read. That, as I said, historically, the 6th day corresponds to the 6th millennium based upon the traditional Jewish timeline. Well, that's now. And all of these things are coming to be known and things are coming to be prepared. Even the Israelites, the Hebrews, are themselves, the Jewish people, are looking at the fact that things are coming to where there's going to be the Messiah will come, and they're trying to bring it in. They are even looking at that. And it's interesting that we're having all of that come together and coming for the threshing. Denise, you had your hand up.
Oh, I was going to say, that's awesome too, because it's like of what they said, of what Pastor Henri said, and Cynthia, is that as we keep coming up higher with the Lord, He keeps stripping things off of us. So when we're in a season of difficulty and we go up to the mountain, we come back down and we're changed. And I know we have to keep going back, to get more and more things stripped off of us because it is like an onion peeling things away from us. But it's awesome that we can do that and how the chaff comes off of us. So when we're struggling or things like that, and we go up to the mountain, God is just taking just layers off of us. So I just thought that was awesome.
I do feel like sometimes I've been beaten pretty good and had to be separated on things and really be brought forth onto what sin was in my life to get it out. So I think all of us can kind of attest to that there are periods where you're feeling kind of beaten down and feeling that there's a lot going on. But I think this goes back to, again, what you were all saying of we're getting in that refinement. you have to be beaten and you have to go through those times in order to get to closer to God. It I think that's why, in my mind, this is why it's so hard. The scriptures tell us it's so hard for a rich person to enter the kingdom of heaven, and it's because, and think about this. uh, If you, I actually was hearing something the other day about churches today, and if you have a very rich church, very often they really don't have the joy. They don't have any of that. And it's because they haven't gone through the difficulties and they haven't gone through the refinement. And I'm not saying that's in all churches necessarily, but I'm just going to say that as a general term. And you see that in people where if they have all of this provision and they have all of these things, then they haven't had to go through difficult times. And it's like a child, when you give a child everything and you spoil a child, what kind of adult do they grow up into? Or if the child has had to go through some adversity in their life and they've had to actually, their parents made them work and made them like clean their room and be responsible. What, how do they turn out compared to the child that was given everything and never had to do anything? Was there any refinement to the child that was given everything and never had to do anything? So I think that's a large part of this for me as well as I was listening to this. So now I'm going to open it up for questions or thoughts to anyone in the group. You can type in the question or you can unmute and ask the question or the thought that you had about it.
Denise, it's Shelley. Can you hear me?
I can.
So I thought was interesting was the letter. To me, it looked like a shepherd's hook, you know, like just imagining Jesus in the field with the sheep, or whoever, just like David. I just thought that was kind of interesting. I don't know if anybody else sees that, but thank you.
Well, let me go ahead and show it again so you can see what she's talking about. Okay. And you can see the letter Vav, but yeah, it has been thought of as sometimes it is called a hook. And it is sometimes called the word and. It's the word and, like I said. And so it's different things, but it actually means hook. So it's a very good guess on that. Very good for to say that because it is a hook. It holds things together. So that was great, Shelley. Thank you. Let me stop sharing. The threshing floor reminds me of our hearts and allows the Lord to show us the chaff so it can be removed to leave behind the wheat for his purpose. Oh, I love that. Thank you, Deborah, for sharing that. All right. Anybody else have anything that they wanted to share or ask? All right. Well, next week, as I said, we kind of, I had to switch the letters around. And so next week, we're looking at the letter Hey, if you want to look ahead. It is the fifth letter in the alphabet, and it's what we're going to be looking at. We're also going to be looking about creation. The Lord really brought in my heart to look at Genesis, and one of the things we're going to be looking at about is some recent scientific studies, some recent scientific discoveries and things that have happened, and how the Lord. There's so much coming about. And remember, I said that a large part of what we're doing is looking at the way they saw it at the time and then the way it applies to us today. A lot of the things that they saw, they would not have had the words for. If you saw a helicopter back then, and some people think that one of the locusts, I don't know if they are, but the locusts in Revelation are actually attack helicopters. If you saw an attack helicopter and you lived in Jesus' time, what would you call it? It has the face of a man in it, but it's shooting fire out and it's shooting weapons out and it's killing people and destroying things. So what would you call it? And locust would be probably the only word you had that would come close to it. And that's one of the things we're going to be looking at next week is what is in Genesis and just the start, just the first chapter, only looking at a few verses, and how things that we see today could apply to those aspects of it. So that's kind of what we're going to be looking at probably going forward for the next couple of weeks, is looking at scripture of how they looked at it and a possibility of a way we could look at it today based upon things that we know today, things that we've seen today, things that we're learning about today, and how they may apply. And in some cases, you may want to agree to disagree with me because some of these are just open areas. Shelley, you have your hand up.
Yeah, just the last thing about that shepherd staff or that that letter. I was just thinking, when you think of a shepherd, how when the sheep falls into a pit or gets into trouble, he can use that hook and catch it around the neck or the leg or whatever and save it from destruction. And that reminds me of kind of the refiner's fire too, how God, if we're in trouble, Jesus pulls us out of it, just a symbolic thing, but pulls us out of it and refines us and helps us. So just symbolically, if that makes sense to you. Thank you so much.
It does. And the other thing you can use with the shepherd's hook or the shepherd's staff is you can beat away, you can use it to push away the wolves or anything that's attacking your sheep, and you can use it as a weapon. So the shepherd would put themselves, a good shepherd will put themselves between themselves and the sheep, and whatever's trying to attack them, so they protect them. So there's also the aspect of the protection that the Lord gives us as well. So thank you for sharing that. Any other last thoughts before we leave for the day? Well, I hope you enjoyed learning about the Goren, learning about the threshing floor and what I have found about it. And as I said, I encourage you, as you read the scriptures, ask the Lord, what should you be seeing in this, and how did it apply, and what is going forward with it, and what does it apply to you today? Because there's so many meanings, and I keep finding as I go through the scriptures, every time I go through the scriptures, I find more and more in-depth things. And I encourage you to do the same thing and look at it and really ask the Lord about it and meditate on it. Meditate on the word and get the bread of life in yourself. Have that word come into your life and be nourished by it. And on that note, thank you guys for coming today and learning about this. And again, if there's anything that you'd like to talk about or to learn about, just put it into the chat or send a message to me, and I will try to cover those areas. So my plans for the next few classes is we're going to be looking at some scientific aspects that have come up, and then we're going to be looking at the High Holy Days. So that will take us right up to getting close and preparing for the High Holy Days, because those come in the fall. And fall's not that far away. So we'll be looking at those as well. So I hope you look forward to this, and we'll be doing more on that the next few times. So now I'm going to close in prayer. Heavenly Father, thank you so much for allowing us to come together, and thank you for letting us learn about how your words have meanings. And there's so much in each one of them, and why it's so important to ask you what they mean and to look into things, because there's so much depth. And the threshing floor, Goren, is such a big meaning for us today, and it held a very significant meaning in the time of Jesus and in the time before then. Throughout the Bible times, it held such meaning, and it meant so much, and it even means more to us today by looking at those things. So thank you so much for allowing us to do that. And if anything was not of rightly of you, please show us so that we can go back to where you want us to be, and only hear and only be rightly aligned with you. And using the sword of the Spirit, separating anything that's not of you, just as you separate the wheat from the chaff, so that we only hear your voice. In your precious name, amen. Shalom, shalom, everyone. I hope to see you next week, and hope to see you throughout the week at different meetings, and especially to see you at the Sabbath service next Saturday. Shalom.
Shalom, shalom.
Hello.
Hello.